So social policy and the family. So when it comes to social policy, a few key definitions. Policy is a set of guidelines and law, something the government has produced, and these can be international laws. A social policy specifically is a set of actions or plans set up by government to deal with a local problem, a social issue, and are quite internal to a country. These policies can directly affect the intended individual, so directly affect family life, such as married persons' tax breaks, or indirectly have an impact where they're not designed to affect the family, but as a consequence of the policy, it has an impact on family in some way. For example, the privatisation of healthcare for the elderly had an indirect impact on family, but we'll come to that in a second. When it comes to social policy, there are two sides to politics. You've got the left wing and the right wing. Right wing, generally associated with Labour. It's generally associated with liberal values. It's more about increasing tax to provide greater welfare support, great healthcare, and greater support for lower levels of society. The state is quite heavily involved in people's lives, and when it comes to family, generally they're quite supportive of all family types, and a lot of diversity is being encouraged. Key thinkers from sociology that have supported left-wing or Labour sort of policies have been thinkers like Giddens, the late modernist. Right wing on the other side is generally associated with conservative values, maintaining the status quo and tradition. Quite tough in terms of law and order. They lower taxes, but at the same time they lower welfare support and state support. There's a greater emphasis on the individual being responsible for themselves, their family, and their lives. When it comes to family life, generally a lot of the policies push towards more traditional values like traditional nuclear families, and new right thinkers, conservative thinkers, have been influenced by sociologists like Murray. Now, the four windows of social policy. So before 1979, we had a number of social policies coming, such as the Beveridge Report, which brought in welfare support and the NHS. We saw Divorce Reform Act, which came in 1969 and then effective in 1971, and that changed divorce proceedings, allowed divorce to become more acceptable and easier to achieve, and then sex discrimination and equal pay. And as we mentioned earlier about those direct and indirect policies like equal pay, sex discrimination, and to some extent the Beveridge Report, these policies indirectly impacted on family, particularly changing the role of women for the latter two. Whereas Divorce Reform Act was a policy that directly influenced the family. Under the new right between 1979 and 97, we had a conservative government. And again, policies came in which had an impact on family life. So again, we talked about those indirect impacts. The Health Service Act. This was the privatisation of healthcare, encouraged people to get private healthcare, but also privatised elderly care. This meant that older relatives were often needed to be looked after by family members, and in turn, that would have meant women became sandwich carers. So again, it changed the family indirectly. Child Support Agency was a policy that directly impacts on families. So again, men couldn't leave their wives, their partners, and have other children elsewhere. They would remain financially responsible. So coming back to the idea of financial responsibility. And last but not least, the Education Reform Act. Now, loads of policies came in as part of this. One of them that I think is quite interesting was the Section 28 policy. This was a policy that meant teachers and schools could not promote homosexuality, same-sex relationships, or any gender diversity. And as such, this would have had a negative impact on same-sex relationships and families. The stigma would have been significant. So it indirectly affected family by banning, in some respects, ability to talk about same-sex relationships and any gender diversity. New Labour came in 1997, and this brought in loads of policies that affected the family life. So paternity rights, childcare, adoption, Civil Partnership Act. Obviously, Section 28 mentioned previously was eventually sort of taken out of being enforced, and this sort of led to greater diversity. And then we've had the Conservatives. Now, we've had various Conservative parties, various combinations of policymakers and various prime ministers. But again, generally some of the key policies would be stuff like reintroduction of married tax breaks, the Troubled Families Programming, targeting lower income families and sort of stigmatising them as causing trouble, legal aid being cut, benefits being mean tested, the housing bill, which again reduced welfare support. So lots of policies which had an impact negatively on the family, some directly, some indirectly. And then last but not least, the theories. Now, theories have different views. Functionalism, anything that's good for society they're going to support. So in their view, policy is good for society because it's meant to be fixing or helping society develop. The new right are going to be critical of anything that does not support traditional nuclear families, anything that maybe creates moral decay, permissiveness and underclass. New Labour is going to be, as we mentioned earlier, very supportive of diversity, different types of family, all types of family. And again, lots of changes that came in, often at odds with the new right. Feminism, anything that improves women's position. So from a liberal feminist point of view, any policy that improves the position of women is going to be supported. They're probably going to be quite critical of new right policies because these may have disadvantaged women, particularly encouraging familiaristic gender regimes. And last but not least, we have Marxism. They don't like any policy because it all benefits capitalism. They don't really like any type of family because they benefit capitalism. And there we have it, social policy and the family.